Hello gamers, this is Sai and welcome back to Outrun Games. Now what did they say about speed?
I feel the need for speed. Ow!
And with that being said, let's get on with the video.
When gaming was in its infancy, gamers of the late 70s and the early 80s had two choices when it came to playing video games. They could either play their favourites on the multitude of consoles available at the time, or be blown away by the impressive power that was found within the arcade and their 5-foot tall boxes of fun. The arcade would introduce gamers to the likes of Pac-Man, Defender and Asteroids, all of which are classics, and the world of gaming may have turned out differently if these were never made. However, by the late 80s and the early 90s, a wave of fantastic new games began to appear, that then went on to become the classics we know of today.
Now, one game that brings a sense of nostalgia for gamers is an absolute classic from the arcades, and this would be Outrun.
Game developer Yu Suzuki was fresh from the success of arcade classics such as Hang On and Enduro Racer, which involved high-speed racing with motorbikes, that he jumped at the chance to develop a car racing game. The idea was to make Outrun as fun as possible for arcade gamers. That an emphasis on easy to use controls was crucial, especially for the stages that gamers would find themselves speeding through. Using the same sprite scaling technique used in his other racing games, Suzuki felt it important that the overall design was key to the game's success. Initially planning to have Outrun to be set across the United States, Yu Suzuki came to the conclusion that the US was far too big and had too many wide open spaces. So he managed to convince Sega president Hayao Nakayama to send him to Europe for inspiration.
Now, I do wonder how that conversation went. Hey boss, with this new game you want me to develop, I really feel that travelling across Europe will really inspire me to make some fantastic locations. I see what you're saying, and you make a very good point. However, I've got one small request.
Yeah, sure. What is it?
You have to take Jane with you.
Ugh. Are you sure?
Oh, I'm very sure. And besides, it's not a request. And who knows, you guys might get along, you might have some fun.
Gee, thanks. Travelling over Europe, scouting different countries such as Rome, Monaco and the Swiss Alps, Suzuki had seen plenty that would help him with developing Outrun, even coming across a Ferrari Testarossa while in Monaco, which he instantly fell in love with. Upon his return to Japan and being inspired by the encounter with Ferrari, Suzuki worked alongside a small team of developers, creating what would become one of the most enjoyable and loved arcade racing games of the 80s. This labour of love took just 10 months to develop, much of which Suzuki had done himself. But it wouldn't be until September 1986 that Outrun hit the arcades, blowing gamers away as well as the competition.
And yes, you've guessed it. Let's go back in time once again to see how Outrun was advertised. Now, Outrun doesn't actually have a story, funny enough, but if it did, perhaps it might go something like this.
With the crystal blue waters crashing up against the sun-kissed sand, the cheers of a crowd can be heard nearby. However, this cheering is soon muffled by the sound of a Ferrari Testarossa. And of course, the driver's playing up to the crowd by revving the engine. The driver is known as Ace Speedwagon, who's a bit of a hotshot and has a vast array of supercars. Each time he has another to his collection, Ace organises a race, and like always, he asks for a volunteer from the crowd. Several hands go up, but Ace selects one lucky lady from the crowd.
What a guy.
The blonde bombshell called Jane walks up to the supercar, gives Ace a flirtatious smile and hops into the Ferrari. And with this, Ace jumps into the driver's seat, puts on his shades, and with a wink towards Jane, puts his foot down onto the pedal, causing the Ferrari to speed off into the distance.
Gameplay has gamers driving a Ferrari in a race against the clock to cross the finish line in time.
Starting out, gamers witness the Ferrari drive up to the start line, and once the countdown is finished, the Ferrari wheel spins and speeds off. With the camera purposely positioned lower to the ground, visibility is reduced, and this is where the fun factor of Outrun comes into play. With winding curves, dips and blind hills, gamers will have to do their best to avoid the many obstacles that will come flying their way at breakneck speeds, such as other vehicles and environmental hazards that become more apparent as gamers proceed to the finish line. Now, Outrun has multiple paths through its 5 stages that each have a unique ending when crossing the finish line. These multiple paths represent different difficulty settings. The blue sky and the sand-coloured beach soon changes depending on the paths taken while playing. Gamers will be driving through forests, along a mountain range, and even along the desert road with a beautiful sunset in the distance.
I'm guessing the Ferrari can traverse the very fabric of space and time, but can it fly like the DeLorean?
When starting Outrun, gamers could choose between 3 tracks to listen to while playing, which in the arcade was a nice touch. Clearly the best song of the 3 is Splash Wave, and while playing I can guarantee that gamers will be either tapping their feet or humming along to this memorable tune.
When released, Outrun was met with positive reviews and went on to become one of the most popular racing games of all time.
Now, gamers would either crowd around the upright arcade cabinet or the fantastic sit-down cabinet that looked just like the Ferrari that was on the screen. There were even some gamers that would put money into the machines just to see the part of Outrun that they couldn't access.
This reminds me of when I was younger and I saw an older gamer playing Time Crisis 2 using both guns, but that's for another video.
Eventually, Outrun found its way into gamers' homes with a faithful port for the Sega Mega Drive, and with this, a whole new legion of fans were made. Even now, when Outrun is mentioned to older gamers, a smile comes across their face, very much the same when talking about Altered Beast and Streets of Rage 2. Over time, there were more Outrun sequels that did their best to replicate the success of the original, even introducing a turbo lever in the arcade that could be used to increase the speed of the vehicle. But gamers would have to keep an eye on that temperature gauge. However, the classic Outrun went down in history as one of the best arcade racing games of all time, alongside some other classic games of the 80s and 90s. Nowadays, Outrun appears on several Sega compilations, but I would love to see Sega return to this classic series, and hopefully, gamers will get the elusive Outrun 3. Maybe the 3rd game will bring back some of the old tracks from the original, and even some of its classic cars. Just imagine speeding through a forest that opens up to a mountain range before heading down towards the sun-kissed beaches while playing against gamers from all over the world. Now, overall, Outrun is a fun and addictive game to play, with some great music and plenty of replayability. Gamers will enjoy racing against the clock to get to the finish line in this fantastic arcade classic from the 80s.
Anyway, come back next time when we return to the streets, but can Axel Stone and his friends defeat Mr. X? Thank you so much for watching, and see you next game.